suspect that all of us who've chosen to come here tonight believe in democracy, believe in the basic structure of the United States Republic and its values. We all pledged allegiance to it a few minutes ago. And so we want our young people to understand and support that system. So all of us were worried when we saw in the mid-1990s that young people were trusting the federal government, for example, at extremely low rates, less than 1 in 5, almost 1 in 10 of young people saying that they trusted the government. And that might seem like not surprising. Perhaps you and I don't trust it so much either. But there's an enormous change over time, because in the 1950s, 4/5 or even higher of Americans generally trusted the federal government. And we weren't thrilled when we got the results of the year 2000 civics assessment from the federal government, for those of you in the ed business, the NAEP civics assessment. Because on that, only 27% of our high school students scored at a proficient level, meaning that those people who designed that test thought that only 27% of our students had a proficient knowledge at all of things like the Constitution, voting, community affairs. So 3/4 did not have a proficient level. And we were concerned to see less than 1 in 5 young Americans voting in congressional elections in the 1990s. And we were troubled to see less than 1 in 10 young Americans saying that they followed the news and public affairs in general, down from much higher 20 or 30 years ago. And it wasn't very good news when only about 15% of young Americans could name their own member of Congress. And I thought it was sad to see that only about 1 in 5 young Americans attended a meeting of any kind of club or organization, because it's in meetings where we learn how to interact with other people and run an organization and keep minutes, and only about 1 in 5 of young Americans were in clubs or organizations in the 1990s. And it's disturbing to see that only a little bit more than half of young Americans are members of any kind of group at all. Now, I've just given you a list of statistics, and I won't do that much more. But I want to say a list is not, as you all know, a list is not a definition. So I've been giving you a list of statistics about civic engagement, but a list isn't a definition. And it would be fair for you to ask me, well, what is civic engagement? Because you're talking about groups and voting and following the news. About the best I can do is I'd say civic engagement is any way we have of addressing a public or common problem, as long as that way is basically ethical. I mean, you could address a common or public problem in really wicked ways, like blowing up buildings or something. But within the limits of what's ethical, civic engagement is any way we have of addressing a public problem. All right, but what's a public problem? Clearly, that's very controversial. Is pornography a public problem? Some people would say yes, some people would say it's a private thing. Is poverty a public problem? Almost everyone would say poverty is a problem, but is the poverty in New Orleans a problem for people in Tampa? It's a question. Cancer? Is cancer a public problem? It's a problem, but if we see it as a public problem, then is a cancer researcher, just because he or she is a researcher, civically engaged? Well, maybe. So, in any case, my main point is that if we define civic engagement as addressing public problems, we're going to have a controversy about what's a public problem. But I think that's perfectly fine, because that debate itself is part of what we do when we're civically engaged. We debate what are our public problems, and you see that playing out right now in a national election where the various candidates have quite different definitions of what our problems are, and that's okay, because we get to vote. Well, why do we need civic engagement? I mean, obviously we need some, but why do we care about millions of Americans being civically engaged? Why can't we leave governing to the government? Why can't we expect public schools like this one and other public institutions to just take care of public services? Why do we have to get millions of Americans involved? I would say for several reasons, and I want to rattle these off for a couple minutes. First, there's a lot of evidence that institutions work better when many people are involved. So, for example, schools function better when citizens in the community, adults and kids, are more involved in joining groups, voting, following the news. In fact, those are much better predictors of how well a school system functions than are teacher salaries, class size, or the student demographics of the school. So if you want your schools to succeed, you have to get parents involved, and I think a lot of teachers and administrators understand that. Second, society is much more likely to be just and fair when many people are involved, when every kind of person is involved. In fact, right now, we have tremendous disparities in engagement. So people with family incomes over $75,000 a year voted twice the rate of people in the lowest income band. And there's a study which looks at why U.S. senators vote particular ways on legislation. The researcher Larry Bartels at Princeton is able to predict the vote of a senator by looking at the opinions of the senator's wealthiest constituents. The senator's poorest constituents in that study had zero impact, no detectable impact at all on the senator's voting records. This is all U.S. senators. It's because, in part, they're less likely to be civically engaged. Also, many of our public problems have to be solved by us. They can't be solved by government by itself. Governments are pretty good at redistributing money. They can tax some people, give other people money. They can define things as illegal and then punish crimes. But very rarely can a government itself reduce prejudice or change the way we relate to nature or deliver personalized care to people who need it, like kids at risk or sick people. We have to get human beings involved in that. And finally, the last reason connects to culture. And I'm thinking of mass culture. I'm thinking of TV and radio and music. A lot of people criticize mass media today, and they criticize it from all different angles. They say it's too secular, materialistic, superficial, violent, sexist, racist, all kinds of critiques. And the critiques are not always consistent because they're coming from different angles. And they may not all be true or valid. But I think what almost all Americans share is a kind of sense that mass media is powerful and that we don't control it. That it's made by relatively few people and it affects us and we can't keep it out. And it affects our teenagers especially, and our teenagers resent that. Now, what's this got to do with civic engagement? Well, if you're not very engaged, if you're one of the 50% of Americans, of young Americans, 48%, who aren't in any kind of group, you're basically on your own against mass media. You're at home watching the TV and you don't have any mediation. If you're in a group, the group itself starts to produce culture that matters to you. It has stories, it has songs, it has a website, it has a newsletter, it has traditions. And that kind of counterbalances mass media. And the richer and stronger your culture, your community, whether it's a church or a school that really functions as a community, the less pushed around you are by mass media and the more you're able to make your own media. All right, I've been talking about why civic engagement is important, but what has that got to do with young people? Why can't we just wait until people grow up and then expect them to be active citizens? Well, you can probably answer the question, but I'll answer it. Since I'm up here, I'll answer it for you. Part of it is that immense amounts of research show that people get on a track to citizenship when they're teenagers or young adults, and then they're citizens. I mean, they're active, engaged people. I'm not talking here about legal citizenship in the United States. I'm talking about how involved you are in your community. Other people get on the path to be alienated or out of it or couch potatoes, and it's very hard to shift people who are adults from one column to the other. It's very hard to think of examples of programs or educational modules or even political movements that have moved large numbers of people from being out of it to being into it when they're adults. But on the other hand, we have lots and lots of evidence that many, many programs can get young people involved when they're young, and they stay involved. So one of my favorite studies, partly just because it's so old, is a study that started tracking the high school class of, I think, about 1960. It's by Kent Jennings. Started tracking them, and they're still tracking them now. And they find that those young people who were involved with school clubs, with extracurricular activities, with student government, when they were 16, are basically managing and supporting our communities today. That's a lifelong process, and on the other hand, those who are out of it then are out of it now. And this is partly why we find that whole generations have characters, have civic characters. If you were influenced by the Depression and World War II, those were forms of civic education, and those caused the whole generation to be much more active than the generation before it and after it. And we can kind of explain why this might be true. When you're little, generally speaking, and it does depend on the context, but if you're little, you don't really have a reason or a need to, I mean, you're a little kid like this high, you don't have a need to interact very much with the big world out there of issues, of politicians, of government. But when you get to be a teenager, you start to notice it. Even whether you want to or not, you start to notice it. You become aware of it as your world expands. And so you form some kind of opinion about it. And your opinion might be critical engagement. I don't like the way things are going, but I care. Or enthusiastic support. Or it might be apathy or alienation. And once you've formed that opinion, what is in it for you to change it? Why are you going to change it? It's going to cost a lot of sort of psychological effort and work and maybe some anxiety to shift your view. So most people just, once they form that initial view, it takes a couple of years, but once they form that initial view, they stick with it. The only exception is when there's gigantic social change. So if our government fell and we had a revolution, people would change their view. And I think vast movements like the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s changed some people. But as things are pretty stable, adults don't change. So certainly I think it would be immoral to write off adults who aren't engaged and say, forget about them. But on the other hand, if we really want to get people more engaged, we're going to have to focus on our young people. So at this point, I'd like to talk about why we've seen the bad news, the pretty serious declines in young people's engagement that I gave you at the beginning, the declines in voting and following the news and other forms of engagement. But I first want to say, and this is quite important, when I'm talking about declines, I'm talking about over a long period. I'm talking about from the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. I'm not picking on young people today, particularly. In fact, the recent trends have almost all been positive, and they've been pretty strikingly positive. One of the things my organization does is we track young people's voting. We're actually the only people really who give you the accurate turnout numbers. And we just calculated that 286,000 young Floridians voted in the primary the other day, even though it wasn't contested in the normal way. Well, that's hard to say, 286,000, is that a lot? But I can tell you for sure, the increases in Iowa and New Hampshire were astronomical. There was a threefold increase in Iowa among young people. They completely, that increase completely dwarfed any other increase among older people. And it's not just voting. For example, volunteering. Young people today, kids today, volunteer at substantially higher rates than their parents. So the problem is, and you know, there are a lot of other, I'll say to the kids in the room too, the young people in the room, there are a lot of other very positive things about this generation. We find, not only in my field of civic education and so forth, but in many other ways, we find things like the adolescent crime rate, the teen pregnancy rate, the drug abuse rate, mostly better than they were in the past. And we find young people closer to their parents, which, since I'm now, and have been for a while, a parent, I find very touching. So we don't have a special problem with young people today, but we do have a long-term problem that young people are much less engaged than we would like them to be. And so let me basically propose two explanations. Very simple. It's too simple, in fact, but I'll just throw them out there for ease of understanding. Two explanations. One is there's something wrong with young people, and the second is there's something wrong with society. Right? Either there's something wrong with young people or there's something wrong with society. Now, I'm not really here to say there's something wrong with young people. I'm not really seriously here to say that. For one thing, if there is a statistical problem, and we have, for example, very low voting rates or not much group membership among young people, I don't think anybody, serious person, is going to blame, say, 16-year-olds for that. The blame is going to fall on parents, educators, politicians, news media, not on young people. But to some extent, there is a problem that's kind of located inside the kids' heads. There are things that we wish would be different about the way they're thinking, and I love it if any of the young people in the room would, after I speak, push back and disagree. But I think that young people lack knowledge that we wish they had, so to get a 27% proficient rate on the civics assessment is a problem. So they score too low on tests of knowledge. They are too uninterested, on average, in public affairs. And they are joining groups much less than they did in the past. And we should try to improve those numbers. And that's part of why what you are doing here in this county and in these schools is so important. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But I'm actually more interested in saying the other part of this. What's wrong with kids? Some things. Well, what's wrong with society? And I want to be pretty sharp about this. Maybe it isn't fully reasonable to expect young people to hold positive views about every aspect of our society. So for example, we say young people should vote. I say young people should vote. I talk to young people all the time and I tell them they should vote. I'm going to vote. But we have an electoral system which is, as many of you know, extraordinarily uncompetitive. Most districts for state legislature and for Congress have been carefully drawn so that the incumbent is going to win, and there's really no competition. 2006, the last congressional election, was extremely competitive compared to past elections, highly contested, and Congress actually changed hands from the Republicans to the Democrats, and yet only 7% of all the congressional seats changed hands from one party to the other. 93% stayed right where they were. In 2004, not a single one of California's legislative districts changed hands. So we tell young people, vote, and then we set up a political system in which most of them, that we can predict, for most young people, we can predict which way the election is going to come out before they show up. And you know, they know that too. So we talk about youth turnout, but we should break it up a little bit. When you look, for example, Minnesota has double the youth turnout rate of Mississippi. So it's not just about youth, it's about the youth in different contexts. Minnesota is a competitive battleground state. Democrats and Republicans are both competitive there. They also do a good job with civic education, do a lot of things right, and they get double the turnout that they get in Mississippi. Another example, we tell young people to follow and pay attention to the news. Again, I tell young people to follow and pay attention to the news. But have you looked at the local TV news lately? And if it bleeds, it leads. The content on there is generally extraordinarily bad. One time recently, I looked at the CNN's, what they call their top stories on the website, and these were the top stories: Ashley Judd, Kim Bessinger, Laura Dern, and Don Imus. Those were the 4 stories in that order. So if we ask young people to follow the serious news and then we serve that up, can we blame them? Or a third and final example, we ask young people to be heavily involved in the civic life in their own schools. We ask them to join groups. We ask them to be part of the community life. It's critical. I'm 100% in favor of that. And yet we'll enroll kids in a school with 4,000 or 5,000 of the fellow students, where only 10 or 12 or 20 or 30 can be on the student government. So you've got 99.9% can't be on it. And where you have lots of separate cliques of students and just no sense of common community. Nobody reads the school newspaper. Why? I'm not saying in this school, but in many schools that I've seen. Why? Because there's 4,000 kids in the school and they all are in different planets, and we haven't created any kind of space that they share. So civic education that teaches young people to admire systems that we've set up that are broken is wrong. It's propaganda. On the other hand, we do have to prepare young people to understand and have appropriate levels of respect and support for the systems we have created, or they won't help us to improve them. We have to prepare citizens for politics, but we also have to improve politics for citizens. Now, I think that, as I said, Hillsborough schools have I'm thinking of a good metaphor, I'm sorry, have broken new ground and led the way, and that's very important. We at Circle have done and collected other people's, mainly collected other people's research on how you teach kids to be active citizens, and we've tried to boil it down to a set of what we call promising practices for schools, and I think Hillsborough is doing most of these things and will do them more and better. So we emphasize that kids should actually take courses in civics, government, and history. It makes a difference whether you study those things. You can't just learn them by osmosis, and I'm told that, Dennis tells me that, that the Tampa schools and the Hillsborough schools have actually increased their support for social studies instead of what's going on most of the country, which is cutting the social studies. Very important is discussions of current events in school. They don't have to be always hot-button discussions. They don't have to be on specifically controversial issues, but they have to be discussions of real live issues. In fact, we find that a lot of the value that you get out of social studies really comes from the discussion of current issues. And these schools are doing kids voting, I think that's your program, which has a very important discussion module in it, doing also the Ought to Be a Law program, where kids are discussing and coming up with bills they want the legislature to consider, and that's absolutely good practice. Service learning, combination of community service and learning about an issue. You know, for example, working on an environmental problem, but also studying the environment. I understand that service learning is supported well in this system. Extracurricular groups, I don't actually have specific evidence about what you're doing here, but I want to say I'm sure you're doing good stuff, and it's very important. So not all of what we do in terms of teaching citizenship happens in the classroom. In fact, I would say the strongest evidence of all is evidence I already cited before, which is that getting kids involved in school groups is a powerful way to get them involved in community life. Students need to have a voice in the way their own schools and other institutions are run. That doesn't mean we turn the schools over to kids. Doesn't mean one person, one vote, and that's how the schools get governed. But it means that kids feel that if they or some peer were to express an opinion about a school issue, like the food or the discipline or the curriculum, they could get a fair hearing. And I was just today with your mayor, and she was telling me about the youth corps, and that sounded like an example of how you can build a sense in a community that kids' voice counts. And finally, there were 6, if you were counting, 6, and this is the last, simulations of civics. And so what's a simulation? Well, you're doing mock elections, mock trial. Those are simulations of citizenship, and they're great because in a simulation you can give young people opportunities that are pretty hard to come by in real life. Like if you do Model UN, you know, not very many of us are going to really sit in the United Nations, but everybody can do it on a practice basis. To work. There's a lot of evidence, and I can talk about this if you're interested, but I tried to cut out a lot of the research stuff, but there's a lot of evidence that these things work when they're done well. They boost kids' knowledge, they boost kids' interest in civic participation, and that's important. But I actually want to, as I wind down, I want to argue that they are actually more important than that. It's not just that they boost kids' interest in civic affairs and get higher test scores. They don't just teach kids facts and skills. They also provide alternatives to politics as we know it, to politics as we adults know it. Youth-led research, kids creating bills for the legislature to discuss, kids creating news media programs, service learning. These things are profound contraries to what we're used to when we think of as politics or civic life when we flip on CNN. They exemplify a kind of politics that is in desperately short supply. And so they lead the way for all of us. And let me say a little bit about why. In general, we treat young people as baskets of problems or potential problems. We see them as vulnerable to academic failure or drug abuse or other problems. And we say, well, that we need to keep an eye on them. We need to assess them. We need to prevent problems. And we need to often exercise discipline. Well, that's all true, but adolescents, teenagers also have great assets that they can contribute to their communities. They have energy, they have idealism, they have creativity, they have knowledge. By giving students opportunities to collaborate, discuss, serve, create cultural products, address significant problems, we can help them to succeed in life. So, for example, we found that participating in extracurricular groups substantially increases the chances that a kid will graduate from high school. In fact, involvement in, just an example, involvement in student government increases the chance that a kid will graduate from college by 18 percentage points. So, while or another example, involving middle school girls in service learning has been found to cut their pregnancy rates as they get a sense of having something to contribute to society, of being important, of being assets. Another example, one of our worst problems, I think, in America today, period, is that a third of our young people are not completing high school at all. The real dropout rate is probably about a third, and it's higher in some of our big cities. We think, well, that means that our kids are not doing well in school, so we need to, not doing well academically, so we need to track them and assess them and do remediation. And there's some truth to that. But in a 2006 study of recent dropouts, most of them actually said that their scores were, their grades were pretty decent. They had a C average or better. But half said their classes were boring, and only about half said they had anyone in the school, any adult that they could talk to about anything. Getting young people involved in community work and problem solving and service learning and discussion of issues bonds them to adults, to caring adults, and increases the chance that they will succeed. So in short, I'm saying that generally we treat teenagers as problems. Civic education at its best treats them as assets and thereby helps them to flourish and succeed. In general, we see education as the job of teachers and principals and schools and research geeks like me. In other words, it's a specialized task to be done by experts. And success in education boils down to kids passing the tests. But education should actually be a community-wide function. Education should be the process by which a whole community chooses and transmits to the next generation the values, traditions, skills, practices, and knowledge that we think is most important. And civic education at its best crosses the lines between schools and communities and reflects a more inclusive definition of education, and we see that tonight with folks from the community. In general, we think of politics in narrow terms. We think of elections, of votes, of public hearings where some activists who will show up at all the public hearings show up and stand up and yell at the public officials. That's what we think of as politics. And I'm in favor of voting and I'm in favor of public meetings. But there are so many other ways today to work on public problems. You can make a website that provides excellent specialized news about a particular issue and allows discussion. You can conduct community research. I was hearing about that today at lunch at USF. And you can identify previously unrecognized causes of social problems. You can monitor the environment yourself. You can go out and actually monitor it. You can bring diverse citizens together for constructive conversations. And our best civic education models these excellent forms of engagement, broadens our definition of politics. And that's critical for us adults because what we have grown up with is way too narrow. In general, our politics is government-centered. It's all about how big or small should the government be. Liberals say bigger, let's get the government involved in healthcare, for example, more involved. Conservatives say smaller, problem is the government, let's shrink it. Well, governments are important, and how big and small they should be matters, and I have opinions about that for what it's worth. Private opinions. But this government-centered view of politics leaves citizens too little to do. All they do is every 4 years they vote on whether they want the government to be bigger or smaller. When we do civic education at its best, we're saying politics is citizen-centered, not government-centered. Young people who are involved are going to form relationships with face-to-face relationships, human relationships with peers, express their interests, listen to others, and then use a range of strategies to solve the problems that they identify, some of which may have nothing to do with the government. And if they want to shrink the government or expand the government, that's fine. If they want to bypass the government, that's fine too. In general, our politics is manipulative. Experts, politicians, pundits, consultants, marketers, advocacy leaders, and the like, they study us, they poll us, they focus group us, they assign us to gerrymandered electoral districts, they slice and dice us, and they send us tailored messages designed to encourage us or to scare us into acting just the way they want. I think that's true of liberal politicians as well as conservative ones. It's true of public interest lobbies as well as business lobbies. It's true of big nonprofits as well as political parties. I think Americans know, especially young Americans, know they are being manipulated and they resent it. They want to be able to decide for themselves what's important and what should be done, and then act in common to address the problems. They are interested in what other people think. They want to get out of what often college students will call their bubbles. They want an open-ended, citizen-centered politics in which the outcomes are not predetermined by experts. And civic engagement, as we get our kids involved in it, at its best is open-ended politics. We don't manipulate our kids into adopting opinions or solutions that we think are right, at least we shouldn't. We give them opportunities and tools so they can deliberate and reflect and then act in ways that seem best to them. In a time of increasingly sophisticated manipulative politics, these opportunities are precious. So let me wrap up. I promise you I only have a little left, to say a kind of summary of why I think what you're doing in Tampa is so important. We can agree, first of all, that America faces grievous challenges. I mentioned the high school dropout rate of 1/3. On a more personal level, I think of a student from New Orleans who said, if you raise your hand and try to answer a teacher's question, you get beat up later. It's as simple as that. And that's a very common thing for people to say. And what a cruel way to treat a young person. If she tries to expand her mind and learn and get ahead, she gets insulted and physically abused in the public schools that we've created for her. Or think of the violence in our society and how we respond by, the solution we have is to jail people so that, and I think we have to do that at least in the immediate future, but just think about the cost. 5.6 million of our fellow citizens, fellow human beings, are either in prison or have been in prison, a rate that is astronomically higher than in any of the other industrialized democracies. What an enormous waste of human capacity. It's not only for those in jail, but also for the people some of them, not all of them, but some of them harmed. Or think of the rapid rise in obesity. For the first time in American history, if the predictions come out right, the next generation will have shorter life expectancies than we do because of obesity. And of course, we face threats to homeland security and global warming. And your list of problems might be different from mine, but I think we can all agree that we face complex and serious issues. These issues will require probably resources such as money to address. I probably can't get out of the high school dropout problem without some money. And laws and regulations might help. I mean, the way the state government in Florida works out its high school requirements and so on, and teacher licensing, these things will matter. But these problems also involve individual behavior, values, and habits of the heart. No legislation could possibly solve any of these problems by itself. America has never overcome challenges like these without tapping the skills, energies, and passions of millions of our citizens. Collaboration is the genius of American democracy at its best. At its worst, we don't do so well. But collaboration and problem solving are in decline. Statistics show it. People are substantially less likely to work on community problems or to attend meetings or to work together than they were a generation ago. That decline most seriously affects working class people and poor people and the communities in which they live. People who don't have, adults who don't have college degrees or any college experience have virtually disappeared from our civil society, whereas they were quite involved in it 30 years ago. We need all of our people to participate in meetings and work on public problems. So if we're going to address this problem, it's essential to involve our young people in civic projects and experiences. We can give them the skills and facts they need to be effective as citizens. We can reconnect them to their schools and communities so that they learn and flourish. They will model new forms of engagement from which we adults will learn. They will critique the institutions that we have left for them and start reforming them. Together, only together, young and old, will begin to build a decent society. That's my conclusion. But I would be happy to, thanks. I would be happy to stay up here basically until you all start looking restless and take questions or comments. So I guess I have a few scattered thoughts. One is, some of this, again, is what's wrong with society, not what's wrong with people. So some of the reason that some of these, I don't even know what Amendment 2 was, but what some of our system is too complicated on purpose. Right? It's made too complicated so that people can't participate, and certainly that's true. You look at California, where they have 50-page booklet, I'm not exaggerating, of amendments, and these are all pushed by special groups which have special agendas, and it's just way too hard. So some of it, we need to reform the system. But some of it, yeah, people, we're facing complicated issues. I often think that our issues have gotten more complicated. I think, right after World War II, we had terribly serious problems, but the problems we had were a little easier, I think, to figure out, at least the legislative remedies. I mean, you had legal racial segregation, you had no access to college for many veterans. Both of those things were solved by, or addressed at least, by legislation that was pretty simple in the form of the legislation itself. Something like global warming, tremendously complicated. I don't pretend to understand it myself. So we are raising the bar, we are demanding more from our young people. The only thing I can say is we're also doing that in the workforce and in college, so in some ways we're just going to need to ask more from them. I guess one other little thought is, sometimes people say to me, do we really want young people voting? For example, it's controversial right now in Maryland whether 17-year-olds should be able to vote in the primary. And I've been saying yes, partly because voting is a voluntary act. Unfortunately, most people don't vote. Among young people, the rate's always going to be pretty low. And those who actually turn out are almost always, they're being good citizens, they're taking time, they're going to trouble. They almost always will impress you with their knowledge. So I don't believe that we have any danger of sending lots of uninformed young people out to vote. I think they will actually, so the 17-year-olds in Maryland who get to vote, they'll vote at like a 25% rate. I think they'll probably outdo most adults in their knowledge of the political system. Well, I want to mention kids voting, because there was an extremely interesting research study which found that, and you probably know it, but maybe you don't, parents of kids who are in kids voting voted at a higher rate than other parents. And it seems that, and they were very careful, and they think they figured out that kids voting actually caused the parents to vote at a higher rate. And how could that be? The parents aren't in the kids voting program. I think that what's happening is kids are coming home and talking about the election, And when kids come home and talk about the election, parents are more likely to vote. And I find that a very optimistic result for several reasons. First of all, I think the stereotype is that parents and kids don't even eat together or talk together very much. And actually they do. Not all of them, but there's a lot of evidence that young people do talk to their parents. And secondly, we think that young people don't bring home the school stuff because that's boring. But actually the kids voting, kids are taking home what they've learned in the program. And then the third thing is we think everything is sort of down from adults to kids. So if there was any influence, it would be adults getting kids to do things. But actually these kids are getting the adults to do it. And I don't think the kids voting is telling the kids to go home and talk to their parents. They're just interested. So it's a long-winded answer, but what I want to say is discussion in the home is a very powerful thing. And I mean, if your parents discussed issues and community life and politics, you're much more likely to vote. The problem with that is we can't manipulate families. So how are we supposed to change that? One answer is if you do a really good, exciting job with civic education in schools, kids will actually bring it home. Right. So I think probably people know what it's heard, but the question is about how we test certain subjects, reading, math, and science mainly. With high-stakes testing, we don't test civic knowledge, so that sends a powerful message to our kids that we don't really care about it. It also sends a message to our teachers that they can't spend time on it. And I think this hits social studies teachers hard because, first of all, social studies may not be in at all, and I don't know the Florida testing regime, but even if it is in, usually what's tested, that is very abstract factual knowledge about things like the three branches of government or the Constitution, which I believe people should know. But the problem is that current event stuff isn't tested, and it would be hard to test it well, and maybe we can't even do that. But the problem is that we know from our research that actually discussing current events is the most engaging thing that you can, or one of the most engaging things you can do. So I think a lot of social studies teachers want to talk about current events with their kids and feel like it's a kind of cheating, like they're stealing time from the requirements to do that. They're civically motivated in doing it. They care about current events, but they feel like, well, okay, we did that for 15 minutes, now we better get back to the material. So I think this is a problem. I have mixed feelings about the whole high-stakes test thing in general. I think some of what we're doing is probably important in terms of disaggregating test scores by race and immigration status and by putting pressure on schools. I have mixed feelings about it. I do think we've created a problem for ourselves with social studies. And we've put ourselves in kind of a bind, too, because one answer is, well, let's get social studies on the tests. But schools feel overwhelmed with the tests they've got. We don't want to have yet another way that they can fail. We also are aware that you can't test every kind of thing. You can test factual knowledge. You can test skills. You can't, for example, say a high-stakes test, in order to pass this test, you have to say that you voted. I mean, I think that would be unethical. I think, for one thing, I think kids have a right not to vote. And so they shouldn't be, you can't put them in a situation where they have to say they voted. Plus they could lie. And we don't want to put kids in a situation where in order to pass a test they might be encouraged to lie. So we're in a bind. I think there's some creative ways around it. For one thing, I think you can actually teach social studies in such a way that kids will do better on their reading exams. I mentioned that extracurriculars seem to have a powerful effect on keeping kids in school. And if we make that the centerpiece of what we are trying to accomplish, that kids graduate, then one of the most important things you can do is extracurricular activities. Service learning has been found on occasion to have positive effects on kids' learning. So there's not a complete trade-off. We may actually be able to use the existing tests to our advantage, but it's a problem. Yeah. So the question is about fifth graders and how they respond to talking about issues and how sometimes it turns into just a shouting match or just like an expression of emotion. And I'm by no means an expert either. I mean, I wouldn't do well teaching fifth graders without a lot of training. I also am not a developmental psychologist. My first thought is that one of our problems is that we adults, especially the prominent ones who are on TV, model how to talk about issues in a terrible way. So, I mean, just terrible. So it's very hard to tune into TV and see people having a reasonable discussion. Even the best of them are trying to score points, and the worst are shouting at each other. And I think we're giving our kids a lot of that, and I think our younger teachers have never had better experiences with that either, even though they know that there's a problem. They don't necessarily have models for the solution. Now, there are so this is where I'm out of my depth to say you should do this program or something. But I do, because I don't know about fifth grade and I don't know what would fit. But there are programs out there, whether it's national issues forums or kids voting in a way or a bunch of others, where they have structured discussions. And you also referred to the problem of neutrality. that you might want to say your opinion, but you don't want to indoctrinate the kids. That's very tricky. I have a lot of sympathy for teachers who deal with that. You want to be neutral, but you don't want to make it seem like there couldn't possibly be a right answer. You don't want to model being an adult who doesn't care, but you also you certainly don't want to say vote Republican or vote Democratic. That would be out of line. But on the other hand, to say, that global warming is happening, I mean, that's trickier. So these are hard, and I think teachers need support. Of course, Michael teaches them to do it, and that's what happens in universities is important. But there are also free materials out there that can be helpful. What are the habits of the heart that teachers should have? That's actually a quote from de Tocqueville, the great French observer of America. And he was talking about really the habits of working together in groups. And he's famous for saying when you get 4 Americans together, they elect one of them president, one of them vice president, one of them secretary, one of them treasurer. And he was amazed by this because they didn't do that in France. And he thought that it was what was supporting and sustaining our democracy. And so he was talking about habits of membership. And I think that's very important. And so I want to partly answer the question by saying, don't forget too, and I know you don't forget, but about the teacher who is the advisor for what's a good, I'm going to say something like camera. Yeah, that could be Young Democrats, but which is fine and good, but I was thinking about something that's really not very political or civic at all. I was going to say camera club, but I think that's out of date. But yearbook or something like that, because it's actually there that kids are going to learn how to run an association, and that will help. I mean, so that's critical, and that's one of the habits of the heart. But I think, to go back to this question that's so hard, it's such an art form for social studies teachers. You have to communicate caring about issues, fairness about different points of view, but I don't think you can simply backtrack into total neutrality, because then you start communicating this idea that you don't have any views, and young people sort of get the idea that either that you're hiding them, which you are, or that adults can't be serious. So somehow you want to say, look, I'm committed in certain ways. I'm a grown-up. I've gone through a lot of thinking. I'm committed. On the other hand, there's other sides of the issues, and that's very tricky. And I think what teachers perceive as being neutral, kids often perceive as being biased, so it's tough. I get that from our mutual friend Diana Hess, who's the real expert on it. So let me agree with that comment and yours as well about interactivity, but I don't want to give away, this is one of those tough questions where there's two sides and there's some kind of balance needed or trade-off, because there are facts that we want kids to have, and there are intellectually challenging skills that we want them to have related to politics and government. The worst thing is trivia. There was a time when on the Maryland exam you actually had to know exactly the number of ballot signatures that you needed to get on the ballot for a state legislative race. So to me, that's trivia. That's exactly the kind of thing you should look up. I don't know it. I don't think they should know it. And I think it might have the effect of making them think that politics is some kind of a very complicated game with a lot of rules, and forget it. On the other hand, to know about the U.S. Constitution to me is essential. And it's intellectually demanding. It's hard to read. People should read it. So I want to just balance those things a little bit. I thought you were talking about English as a second language, which is my own mistake. But I do want to say that regardless of your opinion about the immigration law and debate, immigrant kids are a tremendous civic asset, because they know about another political system, and they know about another culture, and often their perspectives on U.S. democracy are extremely interesting. Often they're more positive than native-born Americans. At least that's my experience. But regardless of whether they're positive or negative, they have an insight. So I would recommend treating immigrant kids as a civic asset. So that was a comment about the citizenship exam, the INS exam. And two little stray thoughts about it. One is, I think, in my opinion, the INS has improved the exam lately so that it's more substantive. It used to be itself a lot of trivia, and now I would say human beings should know the answers to those questions, so it's a better exam. The other thing is, though, I met a bunch of kids in Minneapolis, and actually they were in St. Paul, and Minnesota, and they were Hmong and Latino kids, and their parents all had to take the exam. And they went to the Mall of America in Minneapolis, biggest shopping mall in America, and gave the exam that their parents were taking to a bunch of mostly native-born Americans on video. And of course, the parents flunked the exam. I mean, these adults flunked the exam, and they made a very good video about that. And their point was we need to do a better job with civic education, actually. So it was a comment about kids voting, and Kids Voting USA is a very well evaluated program with very clearly demonstrable positive effects on the kids. I'll just share a story too, that a Japanese TV reporter came to interview me and asked some questions about kids voting and said that she had just been in the upper Midwest in Wisconsin or Minnesota and had gone to classrooms and filmed kids voting, and she wanted me to say what she thought about it. Then the camera stopped and she just asked me afterwards, she said, I'm thinking about quitting my job for Japanese public television and trying to start Kids Voting Japan. Where do you think I could get funding for that? Well, I couldn't help her with the funding, but I thought it was so refreshing to have, because usually news reporters are pretty hard-boiled, and if they get sent off to the upper Midwest to film kids, they're just not paying any attention to what is going on. But this one was about ready to give up her career in journalism to start Kids Voting Japan. So it is a good program. I probably should not take more of your time or overstay my welcome. So thank you. I'll hang around too.